That's pretty good. That's impressive. First, I want to, today for my thoughts that I wanted to give with you, is yesterday I was asked to be part of an ethics panel. There was one person who you know, Dr. Perry Himalis, who is by profession an ethicist, Dr. Gail Wolashak, who is also one of my fellows in the Doctor of Ministry program at Pittsburgh, and myself, who was given the charge of taking what the two of them had said, incorporating my thoughts, and then covering what their thoughts were. And I wanted to share with you a little bit about, a lot of times we think about ethics and we think about the church and how do ethics fit into the church. And we hear so many things about stem cell research, and we hear about cloning, and we hear about all these things, euthanasia, we hear about so many different things with science, and we hear so many different things with just overall ethical questions. And in my thoughts in my presentation yesterday, a lot of these things we're not going to have answers for because technology keeps changing, and so does science. What was valid in science several months ago is invalid today. And Gail, who is, like I said, one of my classmates, is a scientist. She teaches at Northwestern, nanotechnology and bioethics and some other things that I probably can't even pronounce. But one of the things that she said is that the science of yesterday is invalid tomorrow because things are coming out. And if you think about it, how many times have you read in the paper, eat apples because they'll make you healthy, and then a month later you read eating apples causes cancer, or eating blueberries is healthy and then it causes cancer, or it fights cancer. You hear these things back and forth, and so many things are changing over and over, and some of the things are invalid in themselves, and some of the things are valid, but we are forced as Christians, as people, to see through information that has equal value in it. And we don't really know what is more valuable or what is less valuable. My point is, and probably this is probably stirring some questions in you, it's like, what does the church say about this? What does it say about that? And what I had presented was, before we can ask ourselves any of these questions about science, about ethics, about technology and how that interplays with us, we have to ask ourselves a question first. And one of the people at the lecture yesterday asked me a question. He said, well, what does the church say about organ donation? And so I explained to him, and I'll explain to you just in case you're not familiar, but the church is not opposed to donating organs. It is opposed, however, to donating organs for the study of science, for medical research. So we can donate organs to other people. We do blood drives here in the church. Isn't that donating something to someone else? We have parishioners in the church who have given kidneys to other family members. Is that something that's wrong? No. We know that that's the proper teaching of the church. But I said, in that understanding, we have to ask ourselves a question first. And that question first is, what is God's plan? And that question, when we ask that first, all these ethical and medical questions tend to fall into place. One of the issues that was posed was you have someone who's ill and they're on life support for an extended period of time. And this actually came up in one of our sessions in Pittsburgh. And they're on life support, and you know that they're not going to make it, or maybe they will make it. The question is not, is it ethical to unplug them, or is it ethical to leave it in? The question is, how do you understand God's plan for you? Do you think that this is it? This is the final place? Because if you do, you're going to have a backup generator so that plug does never come unplugged. But do we understand that ultimately we have to let go somewhat and rest in what God does, not only as miracles, but also in understanding the plan that this is not the final place for us, that we have to move on. And when we look at questions of people, let's take someone who has had a kidney transplant. Is it ethical for us to say, no, God wants me to maintain my kidneys and not give them to someone else so that I am considered whole? Or is it the giving of that for the life of another person? I had mentioned before, several weeks ago, that there was when I think we talked about this a little bit over the summer, there was a family who had a child who was waiting for a new heart. And they were waiting, and waiting, and waiting, and waiting, and waiting, and then finally the heart came. How did that heart come? It came through the tragedy of another family, but it brought life to that child. So what is God's plan? The plan is that we understand that we are doing something out of love for another person, and we also have to understand that we cannot just hang on and white knuckle, as they say, this life and hold on to everything and say, science will be able to fix me, like Walt Disney is cryogenically frozen so that he can come back to life again. Because he will not, in his mind, give up this life. So if you look at that and you say, okay, we have people that have died who are still in the perception of wanting to live in this world, when Christ comes to them and says, would you like to come with me? Then that icon comes to life. The icon of the resurrection. Because you might ask yourself, and maybe you've posed this before, and I've talked about this icon, why on the people on the left, why didn't they reach out to God when he came there? And that's the whole ethical question. That is the whole response, is what is God's plan? Maybe the plan that they expected was to come back to this world so they could live whatever life they wanted. There's no reason for a person to withhold grabbing the hand of God unless they don't understand what God's plan is. So that icon of the denial of Christ coming to liberate is not that they hated God, but they had no idea who God was, and they had no idea what his plan was. And in that is putting your hands in your pocket and saying, I'm not quite sure. I have a different idea. And when we go with our own ideas, we go down with ourselves. And we ultimately isolate ourselves from God. We isolate ourselves from one another. And although we all know in this church that suicide is wrong, I spoke yesterday about spiritual suicide that happens from not knowing God's plan, from retracting into yourself so much that you have ultimately disfigured and looked at yourself in the mirror and said, I don't even exist in God's eyes. And that might sound like a strong statement, but how many times do we think that God overlooks us? He passes us by because he's too busy, or because our problems aren't weighty enough, or because we haven't prayed right, or we have some kind of distortion in our mind of what it's going to take for God to reach out and to grab onto us. That is retracting from God. So the question that is posed to us in every aspect of life, not only how you function in your job, how you function at home, how you function as a spouse or a child, is everything you do, we should be asking ourselves, what is God's plan for me? And what does he want me to do? And in answering that question, then we can make proper decisions. But without answering that, we tend to revert to a life of humanism and self-introspection without having Christ at the center of that introspection. So, why am I saying this today? I mean, what is ethics and what does all this have to do with you today? Well, it's the new ecclesiastical year. September begins the new year for the church. So it's a time for us to reevaluate in ourselves what God's plan is for us. And that's the beautiful thing about that is it's different for each one of you. It's a little bit different, here and there, and what does God want me to do? But the ultimate plan covers everybody. The ultimate understanding of who God is and what God offers to us is the perfect plan. And that plan is through the life of the church, through the sacraments of the church, and through that relationship with God. And if you think of yourself as being deficient, and I don't have exactly everything I need to get close to God, that's perfect. Because we are a puzzle. And even though we have rounded corners and we might be missing a part, God is coming at us and fills every crack and void, and he is missing nothing. Yet he chooses to fill us. So if we can think of what God wants for me to do, and many times we don't sit and really contemplate, what does God want me to do? We think reactively and not proactively. We are responsive Christians and not proactive Christians, many times. Sometimes on the other hand, but many times we look at the ethical issues and we say, well, what do I have to think now? Because this came up. Well, what were you thinking before is really where we should be. What do we understand for our lives? So in this new year, and I know that many of you are in the new school year and in the routine of not only Sunday school, which will be starting, but also the new school year in society and this new church year as well. Reevaluate and ask yourself, what is God's plan for me? What does He want me to do? And do I really understand what He wants me to do? Because if you can answer that question, everything else in your life will fall into place. As much as you think it won't, it will. And God will lift you up and say, here is your solution, because you've already answered the question. That is just something to distract you. So I pray that we all understand that God's plan for us is a life in Him, not with Him, in Him. And like I mentioned yesterday too, we say Christ is the light of the world and He is the one that offers life. But we can never forget that Christ is life. We go into Christ with communion. We commune with Christ. We go into Christ. We don't walk next to Him. We merge with Him. We commune with Him. And in that communion, we share the life that He is. We can say that He offers us part of that life, but He is the life. So have a life in God, and your plan will surely be answered. Amen.